So thank you for coming tonight. My name is Mark. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Wizcorp.
My name is Cain. I'm the Director of Game Production at Wizcorp.
And today, like Jan basically mentioned, we hope to give a good introduction on how to go on the path to become a game developer or a game programmer. I think like the combination of us two kind of bring a very interesting set of perspective on this. I've been at Wizcorp for almost 10 years now. We started as a web development shop. We ended up becoming a game development company. Cain also started in very non-gaming industries initially, and I think he's going to be touching a little bit on the path that he has taken here. Before we get started, there's a few people I would like to give thanks to. First, Ben for putting us in touch with Jan initially. So thanks, Ben. And also to, this one here, it's called Unicode. It's non-gender specific, and it's one of the mascots that basically shows up at our weekly talk, basically, when we have them, our company stand-up, every Monday. So it's going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be on what does it take to go from having a certain set of development skills and trying to make your way into the game industry. And the second part is going to be on, assuming that there's a few people that might have some web development experience here, how can you take some of your skill set and basically start to go toward perhaps making some web game and even eventually even some native game either for mobile devices or even who knows perhaps mobile consoles or just normal consoles. So I'm gonna let Cain start. I'm gonna give you a talking stick and I'll be joining back for part 2.
Hopefully I can work these buttons out. Yes, okay, this works. Okay, so as I mentioned before, my name is Cain. I'm the Director of Game Production at Wizcorp, and during the day I am also a gameplay programmer. You may notice at the beginning I changed the title of the slides to Road to Becoming a Game Programmer and not a developer, and there was a small subtle reason for that, mainly because I always get myself confused. Because I tend to use the name or word game developer as a generic term for anyone in a games company, and game programmer for more like what I do on a daily basis, which is write code to make games. So sorry if there's any confusion about that, and if I switch between these terms, I am generally a game programmer. So I'm Australian, so I'm sorry about my accent if it gets a little bit hard to understand. It's just, I can't do much about it, I'm afraid. I wanted to just go over a little bit of my history and how I got into games development, because I think this is going to be insightful and maybe help people who want to do the same thing learn from my mistakes and also learn what is actually required. So I started out by studying computer science with the goal of becoming a game programmer. I started in the games industry about 16 years ago, and I actually ended up, I started out wanting to be a game programmer. I ended up being a game designer. I spent like 10 years as a game designer. I completely missed my mark and got into the games industry designing games. It was a lot of fun, but it wasn't exactly where I wanted to be. And over the years, I've been lucky enough to work at companies such as Midway, EA, THQ, Kickside, and now Wizcorp. But I did eventually leave the world of game design and switch to game programming. So, it's a question I get asked a lot, like how did I become a game programmer? How did I get into game development? And what we see on the next slide is a representation of my path, and it was very confusing, very convoluted, and I eventually got there. But the reason I didn't go directly into game development wasn't because I didn't want to, it was because I really didn't know how. So I wanted to demystify this and just demystify some of the myths of getting into the games industry. For a start, I think, from my perspective, I really thought that it was an unattainable goal. Like I looked at all my heroes like John Carmack and all that kind of stuff, and I thought, there's no way I can be as smart as these guys. Like, how the hell am I going to get into the games industry? But it turns out it's a lot easier than you think. And in fact, the industry needs more devs. It needs more people who are passionate about games. It's really not that unattainable a goal. So I'm just going to, in the next couple of slides, go over what a game developer or game programmer does, just in broad strokes. very circuitous route into the games industry, as you can see, and it's because I just didn't know how to get there. I come from a very small country town in Australia. We didn't have internet in the 1980s, obviously, and in fact, not even into the 90s. And so I thought the way to get into games was like you had to become like a mathematician or a physicist or something like that. So I ended up going and studying computer science, and then I did become a chef. And I do not recommend that if you want to get into games. It's the hardest way into games. That's how I paid my tuition. I got a government IT job, and that was utterly soul crushing. And so while I was there, I picked up, it was a lifelong game player, but I picked up a game called Half-Life, and there was one of the first games that came out that was commercially available that had like an editor and a toolkit. That was actually the same toolkit that the company themselves used to make the game. And so I spent hours on that, just learning how to make levels, how to create content for it, sharing my levels online, and eventually I built up a portfolio. Like it was actually some really cool levels, and we were playing online with friends, and people shared them around. And it got a bit of word out, and I found out that in the city I was now living in at this point, there was actually a games company there, and they found out about it, and they wanted to play it, and they called me up, and I got an interview. And it was this hobby of just making content for games, rather than actually all my study and the previous work I'd done, that actually got me my first interview and my first job. It taught me skills about the language of game design and game development. It taught me about scripting logic, how games are made, how tools work. Often you find out that often in the industry they work pretty badly, but it's one of those things that the problem solving that goes with that is actually really, really good for learning how games work. And it also gave me this portfolio I could shop around. And unfortunately I've lost my portfolio, so I've got nothing to show on that, I'm afraid. But that was many, many years ago, as you can see. Then I got into the games industry, kept making games for all those other companies I mentioned earlier, eventually moved to Japan, and now I'm at Wizcorp. So, let's back it up a bit and we'll talk about what a game programmer / developer is. This is not entirely inaccurate. I think sometimes for a lot of people it's a bit of a mystery what they do. I still can't explain to my parents what I do. They really have no idea what I do. But the simple and let's say somewhat unromantic answer of like what a game programmer is someone who creates interactive software. And another way of thinking about it is that we solve problems through code in such a way that a player can have fun and hopefully engage in this experience that you create for them in a way that they get enjoyment out of it. So ultimately, it's a technical process, but we're making creative products. So as an example, like I'll just go quickly something that I did this week. Again, I can't show any images, I'm afraid, because it's all under NDA, but one of the things I was working on this week is I had to take a 3D character mesh that had been created by an artist. I had to convert that into a format that I could actually run in our engine. And the purpose of this was to create a character customization screen so that we could create thousands of different variations based on one single mesh. And that was quite a challenge, especially in the technology that we're using, which is HTML5 / JavaScript. One of the problems you find is the pipelines are not that well defined in HTML5 and JavaScript and Node.js. So what kind of problems did I face? What did I have to solve in this last week? Well, as I said, the file formats for 3D tools, they're really not always fully supported by the game engines that are available on the web. So I might only find that some of the required features actually work. So then I have to find workarounds for that. I might find too that what I'm asking my artists to do is maybe outside of their area of expertise. So we have to like learn how that works together and teach each other. So how did I solve it? Well, eventually someone's going to play your game and they're going to enjoy it and they're going to talk about it for years to come and talk to their friends about it or whatever. So it is a very satisfying process. What else do I do on a daily basis? Well, I just write game code, so that is making characters run around, jump and shoot. Also sometimes write network code, so that means you're letting players run around, jump and shoot, but at each other over a network. I review other team members' code, and I also participate in other aspects of the game production, like looking at new tools and evaluating game design. So the point being that as a game programmer, you're involved in many different areas in the production cycle. Like it's not just sitting there writing code, you're also talking with artists and animators and all these other really interesting aspects of skill sets that you come across that you may not get to mix with when you're just doing, well, say just when you're doing web development or something like that. It's a little bit of a different environment. And yes, you do end up looking like that a lot. People come and So I just want to give a brief overview of the kind of people that you will work with in the games industry. This is really a very simple breakdown because some of the studios are working, for instance, that list could be 5 times longer, but broadly speaking, when you work in the games industry or in a games company, you'll obviously meet programmers, there'll be game designers, producers, 3D modelers, animators, concept artists, UI artists, obviously HR, writers, QA, and so much more. And that's the thing to keep in mind is that the road into game development may not necessarily be through programming, but that's the one we'll talk about today. But like me, I came through the role of game designer. In fact, my very first job was actually as QA, which then got me into game design, which then got me into programming. So yeah, it's one of those things you will find people of all walks of life in the games industry. I've been very lucky in my years that I've been able to work with people that have worked on large-scale films, or even a guy who was a designer for Disney rides, and that had parallels with game development. So I was able to work with some very, very interesting people over the years. With writers, for instance, I was lucky enough to work with some well-known Marvel writers on a couple of games, so that was incredibly exciting. It's just, as an industry, you get exposed to people you may not have thought you'd be able to get exposed to. Now, as far as game programming or programming industry, what kind of things can you do? Now, I think for the most part, there is this perception that when you enter the games industry as a programmer, you might just be, writing code to make characters jump and shoot at each other. But there's a lot more to it. What I do on a daily basis typically comes under the title of gameplay. But there's also animation programs, there's obviously AI and physics and that kind of thing. VFX is fascinating. Like I worked with a VFX guy who, hopefully he's not watching the Facebook stream because he'll probably know what I'm talking about, but he went on to, he was a VFX programmer, but he went on to work on some quite well-known science fiction TV shows that we were probably all seen working in those. But yeah, it's like camera programming, cinematics, technical art, which is a fascinating area. This is where you actually write things. We actually interface between code and art, and so typically this kind of person has like a very creative side, but they also know how to code, and so they'll come up with solutions to creative problems using code. It's absolutely fascinating all the different areas you can get into, and I just wanted to put this slide up to give you an indication or a sense of like when you get into the games industry, it's not just a one-note thing. There is a lot of different ways you can spread your wings and develop the games industry. And like I said, this is not exhaustive. I mean, in the larger companies, you can get pretty granular. Like I did work with one guy once who literally spent 2 years writing a cloth simulation for a superhero cape. And I think he must have been dreaming about cloth simulations by the end, but that's what an advanced maths degree can get you. So yeah, it can be pretty specific at times. You know, the guy who just does the water simulation in the game or something like that. But the point being is that if there's anything you enjoy doing in code, there's likely a position that you can actually work towards. But often the point of entry for new developers is as a generalist or a gameplay programmer, like is effectively someone who will take on the role of solving not simple problems, but the general problems, the ones that are not necessarily under something more specific here. So it could be things like we need to implement some sort of basic collision system or something in a 2D game, for instance, or integrate some sort of API from a third party, those kind of things. Alright, so you want to be a game programmer now. How do you actually become a game programmer? So this is the question I get asked a lot, and if you recall my first slides, I really struggled with answering this myself. And ultimately it just comes down to practice. Like, you'll be surprised how quickly you can get up and running, especially if you know how to program already. There are lots of good books and courses, which I highly recommend, things like going onto Udemy, Plural site, used Amazon obviously to get books and stuff like that. But the most important thing is practice making games with whatever you have at hand. Like, it doesn't even have to be code, to be honest. Like, you could start with board games or card games and stuff like that. Understanding game mechanics is not actually something that you need code for. But if you want to be a game programmer, obviously it's a good place to start. What kind of skills do you need? It's an interesting one because I think one of the biggest concerns people who are first wanting to get into the industry have is, I don't know enough math, or I don't know physics or stuff like that. And to be honest, that stuff is important eventually, but not at the start, and not necessarily even at the end, depending on where you end up working. Like, there are some areas of game development where you'll never touch any math. There are others where you need to be perhaps in an advanced degree in maths, like the guy who's doing cake. He probably wish he did that maths degree. But basic skills that you need, there are some human skills you need, like you need to have good communication, you have to have patience, and I think most importantly, just a willingness to not know the answer ahead of time. There's a lot of games development which is kind of tricky, and it's like a puzzle. You're trying to solve something, and probably why I enjoy it so much. It's almost like a game itself. The act of making a game is like a game. Obviously, programming skills, things to learn there would be basic algorithms like pathfinding, search, learn how to write good code, clean code, learn how to code together, learn how to use things like GitHub. But ultimately there's nothing really outrageous there. It's like, to get that first job, that first interview, you don't need to be a master programmer. I did mention maths before. There's a little bit of maths that's very useful. Like, this is where I was really frustrated in high school because I asked my teacher all the time, why do I have to learn linear algebra? Why do I have to learn geometry? And they can never tell me. If they'd said games, they would have had an A student there, but he didn't. I don't think he knew. But some basic linear algebra and geometry will get you a long way, because this is what you use to move characters around the screen, to do distance checks and that kind of stuff, which is very, very useful in basic games, 2D or 3D. And then from there, like, you might say, if you know calculus or statistics, that kind of stuff can become very useful too. But honestly, you'll get a long way with some basic linear algebra, and you can do a lot without it. But make your life easier and just learn a little bit of linear algebra. But the most important skill you have to have is a passion to create. So you can learn much of what you need to know as you go. You will find problems along the way, you'll solve them, and then that will be your toolkit for making games. So don't worry too much if on day one you know nothing about how to add two vectors together. You'll work that out while solving other things. So I wouldn't necessarily go and do 2 years of maths before you start looking at games. Start with games and solve the problems as they come up. Do I need to learn a specific language? Now, I've heard a lot of people say that you can't do games unless you know C++, and that's just flat out false. Any one of these languages and 20 others you can use to make games. In fact, we use at Wizcorp on a daily basis JavaScript and C#, so we're not making games using C++. There are some great engines in Rust, Python you can write games in, you can target iPhone, Android and all that with any of these languages. So I would say no, you don't have to learn a specific language. I think the most important thing is that when you're learning, just use the language you're comfortable The goal is to actually make games. Like, don't worry too much about like whether or not you're a master at C++ or the language that you're choosing to work with. Just make games, and through the act of making games, you'll get better at programming. And then you can build up your portfolio, and then you have something to show. And then you get into games, and then you can worry about C++ later. Of course, if you know C++, that's also a great language for games. Okay, so what do you need to do from here? How do you start? So I think the following advice I'm going to give you is relevant no matter what you want to do in games. But specifically, I'm going to sort of focus on the idea of programming. But it should follow that much of this is the same if you want to be a game designer or whatever that is. It's just you have to adjust for the appropriate role. Play lots of games. You really need to play a lot of games. Why do you need to be a game player? I think you need to play games a lot because it builds up a common vocabulary. For instance, when you're talking to another developer about, say, double jumps or DPS or something like that, you need to understand what each person is saying, and it becomes like a shorthand. Like you find in conversation when you're designing a system or code in a game studio, people will just say, "Oh, you know, like in that game," or like the thing in that game. And instantly, if you play the game, you know what they're talking about, and it saves a lot of time. It also gives you an understanding of whether or not that system actually worked in that game. You know, like you might point out, I can never think of bad examples of games for some reason. You might point out a bad example of a game and say, I want to do the system like that, and then everyone else in the room could point out why that might not be a good choice, but at least you've got a common vocabulary. You also need to understand how common problems are solved. The interesting thing about games is that I think sometimes there's a tendency to want to reinvent the wheel, but most of the problems that you face in games have been solved at some point. You know, like UI issues, control issues. So if you, like for instance, if you're in a game where you're in a multiplayer scenario and you've got teammates in your squad and you need to be able to find them, how might you go about doing that? Is it arrows on the edge of the screen? Is it a shader that shows their outline through walls? What are the requirements of the game? And you can discuss that with people and then point to other games that have done that in a similar way and talk about the pros and cons of that. At least, again, you've got a shorthand instead of having to describe what you're talking about. But I do think it's really important. You need to know, the other thing too, and this is really key, you need to know about the tricks of game programmers and developers. Game developers are really tricky people. Like they spend their life pulling the wool over your eyes, which might be an Australian saying, I'm not sure. But tricking you, basically. So I want to give a couple of other examples of this, but it's a term that I use a lot when I talk about games. Game development or game design is basically magic. We play tricks on players all the time, such as in the Bioshock series. The first projectile is fired by an enemy, if you've ever played Bioshock. But the first projectile is fired by an enemy will always miss. And the reason for that is to give the player a heads up that there's an enemy there. It makes you feel powerful. You get time to react and maybe take them down. It's an amazing piece of game design. It's actually really simple, but like if you didn't do that, everything would work just as it was, but the player wouldn't have that same kind of feedback, that feeling. Another example is Assassin's Creed and the latest Doom. They both use the same trick, but you can take more hits as you get lower in health. That's really cool because it gives you the sense of always surviving just by the skin of your teeth. Maybe that's another Australian one, I'm not sure. But it's always that you feel like you're just barely surviving, and that's a really important thing. Like you're trying to use code and design to make players feel a certain way. And then there's also my favourite, which is the fabulously named Coyote time, named after Wile E. Coyote in Roadrunner. In most platform games, most good platform games, when you step off the edge, there's a moment where you can still jump. It gives you that, I don't know why it is, but players tend to always just step off the edge and then drop. They think about pressing the button a bit too late, probably reaction time, but it's a great little mechanic that developers use to give the game feeling more responsiveness. So there's literally lists of this, and there's a great GDC talk called, I think it's game design is basically a magic trick or something like that, and it's well worth a watch, but by playing games you'll start to see how the game developers are training you to think and act in certain ways. So the other thing we can do is participate in game jams. This is a really key thing, I think. It gives you a lot of practice in making games. It's highly underrated because I think people don't feel like they necessarily know how to do everything or how to, they haven't got time or whatever. But if you can make time to actually put yourself into one of these kind of competitions, and there are literally hundreds of different game jams out there. I think there are some run in Tokyo locally. There's a lot that are done online. itch.io do new things every so quite frequently. I really encourage people to do this because it gives you practice in making games and the full development cycle in a very short period of time. So a game jam is typically done in, say, between 2 to 5 days, something like that. And you have to make a full game. And what that does is it teaches you about planning, it teaches you about game design. You often are stuck with not having an artist or an animator, so you learn to work within constraints. Sometimes you also learn maybe a bit of art or something like that. But I highly recommend this because if you enter this and then rinse and repeat, you'll learn how to make games and it will also give you a portfolio. And just on that, we recently, I think we hired this guy. We had a person who actually applied with a portfolio of game jam games, and it was very impressive because he gave us something that we could talk to him about in the interview, and it was also just a real show of his passion for games, love for games. So I highly recommend that. Oh, and I would also just say, I don't know if you know these games, but there's a couple of really famous games that have come out of game jams. Like literally, the developers went in with like a small idea, made the game in 2 to 3 days, came out, and then realized the game was awesome, and they finished it, and it went on to be very popular. Like there's a game on iOS called Chameleon Run. There's also the rather infamous game Goat Simulator. Highly recommend that. And Superhot, which is another great game. The other thing you can do is make games and release them. Now, you don't have to put these on the App Store, you don't have to go to that extent, but certainly putting these onto sites or like game aggregators or itch.io, like saying that you can do game jams, you can also release games through there, but there are plenty of other ways to do it. But the important thing is just put games out there, get people to play it, get feedback. You can even go to Reddit, and there's a couple of good subreddits there where they talk about game development. Post your games up there to get feedback. It's really important that you get feedback on games because there's always a tendency to work in a bubble when you're doing game development and think your game is great, but putting it in front of people and getting feedback can be really important to A, make your game better, and B, just understanding how people actually react to it. And then again, just rinse and repeat, just keep going at it. Another thing you can do too is work with the open source community. So these are a couple of engines that we use at Wizcorp, and they're all open source. But it's not the only things you can contribute to. There's plenty of stuff out there. There's like lots of tools for things like actually editing maps, for doing editing textures or creating atlases and so forth. Really important community out there. Like we could not make games at Wizcorp without the open source community. It's a very rich tapestry of tools. And this is overlooked by, I think, quite often by aspiring game programmers. I know I missed this point because I had the word portfolio and I imagined like a folder with art in it, and I was thinking, well, how can I do that as a programmer? And I realised much later that my levels that I made for Half-Life, they were the portfolio. And now these days things have become a lot easier to make portfolios for game developers and game programmers. Like, as you can see here, there's a number of engines and tools that are fully fledged. That are, in some cases, they are industry standard. I mean, Unreal has made some of the most famous games in recent times, and the others are all very competent. And you can see that there are different languages that you can target. I highly recommend picking a tool and into start making games and start creating a portfolio. Don't worry about the size of your game, just make it complete. Like Flappy Bird sort of scale is fine, just as long as you have something you can talk about, the problems you solved, the reasons that you make design decisions, the challenges you had when you were using those tools, and how you solve them. These kind of things are really important in the interview. And as I said, don't worry too much about the tool itself. Like a lot of people get stuck in a trap of going, oh, I'm using Unreal, but maybe I should be using Unity, and they're worrying a lot about that. Honestly, a lot of the stuff is transferable in terms of like how to make a game. Just concentrate on making the game itself. And now I just want to briefly talk about like, when I'm interviewing people at Wizcorp, what I look for in a game developer. So you've got your portfolio together and you've knocked on our door and we've been impressed that you've got a portfolio. What are we actually looking for? And the answer is mostly passion. Like it's a strong desire to become a game developer, game programmer. So you should play games. You can talk about the latest games. You can talk about old games, which is actually surprisingly important because you don't want to repeat history. There's a lot of good lessons to be learned from the older games. You can talk about the mechanics of the games, what is good, what isn't, and how you might fix the problems. Seeing that there's a participation in the games community is really important. So like whether you've made tools or contributed to engines or projects or just participating in game jams, that kind of thing, that really helps. And also just the knowledge of basic game development. Like if you can demonstrate a finished game, no matter how small, when we know you've gone through that cycle, you've come up with the idea, you've actually written the code, you've found all the problems, you've fixed the bugs, and then you've actually finished the game. And it's just very useful because it gives us a talking point in the interview. Also, you might get lucky in the game, the person interviewing you may just play the game for half the interview and get out early. So, game development is probably more accessible than you realise. The games industry isn't just AAA, so don't make a mistake of thinking that. I think that has always been a problem for people when they think, well, how do I get in the games industry? I could never work at Riot Games or something like that. That is not the industry as a whole. There is a very specific niche for AAA games, and that is a lot of fun, but there's also a lot of fun to be had in casual games or mobile games or in other emerging areas that have parallels with games like VR and stuff like that. Casual games obviously make up a vast majority of the sales out there, just worldwide, but also particularly in Japan because we live in a country where mobiles are everywhere and we've got really good internet access, so it's a very popular type of game to make here. There is a good demand for enthusiastic game developers in the industry. Like it is hard to find developers, so you have that benefit. And when you start out, it just seems overwhelming. So it may be not clear where to go, what to do, or how to get yourself noticed. And it always seems like there's too much to learn. But don't worry about that. Just get started, and you'll eventually get there. So if I had my time again, I would get a copy of Unity or an equivalent engine, something you feel comfortable with. I would make lots of small games, always with the goal of learning a new aspect of development with each one. And I would participate in game jams, and I would make a goal of releasing a game either on the App Store or to some public site, somewhere where I can share the game. And then just rinse and repeat, and approach people, go to events like this and talk to developers when possible. But most importantly, and this is the key thing, when you're making games, make sure you have fun. Like games are about fun. They're about play, and they're about creating and sharing experiences. So don't make it a chore. And I think if you do that, you'll make more games and you feel better about it, and you'll have more chance of success. And that's it. So anyone have any questions?
Yeah, well, hi, first of all, a great presentation. And I've heard this expression about, I'm not a game developer, I've heard this expression about people who create games that they say if you love games, you shouldn't make them because then you'll start seeing them differently. So I was just going to ask you if you see them differently, how do you create them? And
yes,
you'll probably hate this question, but what's your favorite game?
Okay. So to answer your first question, yes, I do see them differently. Like I can see under the hood a bit and understand how it was made and the kind of tricks that they're doing. But I don't think it's diminished my love for games in any way. So from that point of view, I can see the point of that comment and why people would say that, but I think in all honesty, if you love games, you'll probably just see it from a slightly different perspective now when you get to make games. In some ways, it'll probably give you a greater appreciation for the art, but it hasn't diminished my love for games itself. What's my favourite game? It's an old one, but I think I played something like 500 hours of Baldur's Gate 2. So I'm into RPGs, but then to be honest, there's so many games out there. I'm sure I've been playing recently, but the latest God of War is very good. But I get fun out of everything, like mobile games and so forth. Yes.
So for the game jams, I was wondering what you think, like what's the primary motivation for doing that? 'Cause I remember some friends did the global one.
Yes.
So it's like, I guess like if you're talking about hackathons, the advantage is like working on a team, maybe having that motivation. So is it like the motivational aspect? Because if I were to do it online right now, I'd probably be doing it alone. So it's like, maybe I should just make games.
Yes, that's a good point. So there's a couple of different motivations. I've seen people do the online ones, for instance, particularly itch.io. I'm not sure what their status of game jams are at the moment. I believe they're still running them frequently. And the great thing about that is you can post the game online and then it gets reviewed by other players. And so there's a feedback loop that occurs there. People say things like, great game, but I found a bug at this point, or great game, but I wish you'd done this with the mechanics. So there is that aspect of it. But I do agree, like the ability to work with other people in a team, even if it's a small team on a game jam, is actually probably one of the best. So if you can find local game jams, highly recommend that. Particularly because, like I said, not everyone's a good artist or not everyone's a good designer, and so it helps to have other people that can join. And I think probably the last motivation I would suggest is just the practice of. The one thing about game jams is that if you stick to it, it forces you to finish in a short period of time. And there is a saying in games is that I think it's in most software, but the last 20% is the hardest. And it's true that there are more people that have started games in the industry than have finished them. And sadly, I've worked on a few games like that where we've done 3 years and get to the end and it's like, oh, we can't finish it for various reasons. That does happen from time to time, so it's really good to go through the whole cycle.
Advice to deal with frustration. Because sometimes for your own limitations, sometimes for the industry limitations, just get limitations. Sometimes because people is just so spoiled when they think any game needs to be like a PS4.
Yes.
Right? So there's a lot of factors that can lead you to frustration.
Yes.
Of games, right?
Yeah, so I think a lot of, when it comes to dealing with community feedback, you really have to sometimes have a bit of a thick skin with that. I think just taking a bit of a detached approach from that, because the internet community can be a little bit vicious about it. So, generally, if you work in a community like ones which are built around game jams and stuff like that, everyone is in the same boat, everyone is really positive, and I think it works very well. But when you exposing yourself in, say, just on Twitter or something like that, you can get some interesting feedback. I think the answer is just don't take that personally. When it comes to things like deadlines and that kind of stuff, I think really, like I said, I treat game making like a game in a sense, and so it's a puzzle to solve. And so I'll take the same approach. I'll just look at the problem and come at it from different angles. If it's not working one way, I'll come at it from a different way. Obviously, I also like to lean on people in the studio as well. Ask for advice or talk amongst the peers and see what we can come up with. Generally, it's weird, but I don't think I've ever really run into a problem I couldn't solve in 16 odd years ago. But there are times where it gets down to the last minute. But that's kind of exciting. That's the adrenaline rush. And games development is like that. It does have a, just by the, I guess in Japanese it says, I hope that answers your question. I guess the other thing too is meditate and play games. Actually, that is actually a really good point. I probably play games most to relax, which it sounds weird, but after a day at work in the game mines, I would go home and I'd actually just fire up the PS4 or something, play a game, usually something in a different genre, and just relax that way. Alright, that's it. I'll hand over to Mark.
Time-wise, we kind of have almost an hour left that we can use, and so and I probably have about, depending on how many questions you have, and by the way, just raise your hand at any point if you do have a question. So depending on how many questions there's going to be, it could be 25 minutes to 30 minutes, could be filling in the hour. If it doesn't fill the hour, I have a bonus talk I can make about, so basically a presentation I made 2 months ago about the games that I like, and just like play a little games with everyone in the audience as to try to figure out, like, you know, where your knowledge of games actually stand. But on to the second part of this talk, developing games for web developers. So by raise of hand, how many people here are working for companies, or are basically, you know, mostly involved in product development and software development that's web oriented? By raise of hand. Right. Okay. How many of you have have done canvas programming in some way, shape, or form? Okay, that's actually pretty good. How many of you have used non-JavaScript languages for writing your code? Okay, great. So I'm assuming mostly TypeScript, right? And so, okay, so that's just basically to give me a little bit of a picture, right? So, you know, if you do web development, I can guarantee you are probably closer than you might think, especially today, to become a game developer than you might think. As we're going to see in this talk, there's a lot of tools that exist today, a lot more. A lot of it comes thanks to actually Adobe in the ActionScript era and the developers that actually pioneered web game development. Whether it's like tower defense games or even very elaborate games done in 3D before Flash actually supported 3D officially. I think Flash was basically had APIs for 3D like since 9, I think. I may be wrong, but there's a lot of stuff that basically, you know, built communities. A lot of people actually started to take that, bring this into JavaScript, and today we're going even further and we're going beyond JavaScript. So we're going to be touching a little bit on this today. But before we get started, you know, we've already touched on web technologies like Webpack and TypeScript, which I assume to a certain degree you've either heard of or you're using quite frequently, even if you don't set them up yourself. Those are tools that you're going to be able to use back. Having a very good level of familiarity with those tools is going to be good. And even actually, if we're talking about TypeScript, it's quite surprising to see today that there's quite a few engines that either have good community around the typing files that are being created for them, or literally basically engines that have been coded straight out in TypeScript. And so there's a lot of so those tools, if you know them well, if you're familiar with them, the more you get familiar with them, the more you're going to be able to use them. But you know, there is a major difference though between frameworks and engines. So frameworks, you know, we're going to be talking mostly about stuff like, you know, React, Vue, Riot, HyperApt, Elm. That's basically the only one that's non-JavaScript-y, I think, in there, really. But Angular, this one I actually didn't know. It's one of the few ones I didn't know, but I think it's called Wakanda. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this one, but apparently it has woes. We good?
Yeah.
Yay! And you know, the Polymer, and Polymer and so on. And you know, to a certain degree, and I understand that, you know, that might raise some controversy here, but they're kind of more or less the same. So sure, you have like, you know, your categories of frameworks that are going to be doing React, you know, that's are like, you know, your reactive category. I don't know where Riot is at this point anymore. You're gonna have systems that are gonna be like, you're kind of like, very elaborate system for doing enterprise scale apps. Things that are gonna simplify testing on the UI, and so on and so forth. But all in all, I mean, you don't have to go over much of a stretch, I think, to go and say, oh, I'm an Angular programmer, and I've done it myself. I mean, you're an Angular programmer and you want to learn Vue, or you want to learn Vue and you want to go in Angular, right? You're gonna have to learn a few things. But in my personal experience, when I have done that, it would take me maybe a week or two, and then I would have like a pretty good idea of where I'm going. When you're talking about,
Can you check the connection?
sure, yeah.
Nothing's changed.
Murphy's Law, whatever it has to go wrong, will go wrong.
If not, you can just plug this directly in.
Which one? This one. So we might actually end up taking the whole hour. All right.
That will shift it.
All right. It'd be really cool if you had those old screens like, please stand by. All right. Let's see if that is going to be part of the box. All right. This one. Alright. So we were at Alright. So yeah, like I said, pretty much the same. But when you're starting to talk about game engine, it gets a little bit trickier. There's the one, those are basically the engines that we've played with a little bit at Wizcorp. But they have various degree of evolution, and they have various level of focus on different areas. So you're going to end up with, some of them are going to be really for 2D, others are going to be for 3D. Some are going to be focused on basically providing a very rich and easy to use API aimed at making programmers' life easier, while others are going to be focused on providing an editor or a set of GUI tooling, basically, to allow the rest of the team to basically contribute directly into the game making process and have a little bit more of an interactive experience, right? So when you fire up Unity, that's what you kind of get. You can basically have your C# editor on the side, and yeah, you're gonna see you're gonna be able to run that pretty much right away. But you also want basically people who are going to be adding visual elements into the game to be able to kind of play around with that and see how it feels. And it's not, unfortunately, when you're talking about web games, Unity might actually change that very soon, but if you talk about those frameworks, it's very, very tricky to basically pick one that kind of has it all, right? So it's really like, so the first choice you're going to have to do is, are you going to favor code? To give you an example, this is it's actually much longer than, a little bit more longer than that, but this is just something, I think, to do basic lighting in Pixie.js. It's not necessarily hard to understand, but the moment you make it into code, that means that the rest of the creative team might not have as easy of a time to just go and tweak with play around with things and see if they can make it look just a little bit more different, right? But at the same time, if you're talking about an editor, then you end up, this is the Play Catalyst editor, by the way, but you end up with a lot of stuff that you have to learn that, well, yeah, it might take a while. And oh, by the way, that editor is actually a simple version if you compare it to editors like the one that's provided by, say, Unreal or Unity. So you kind of have to make a choice here. But there's no whole. Now, unlike in the Last Crusade, there is no holy grail. There's no right answer. There's no one thing you're going to use and just going to be okay. Even if Unity has made that their mission for the last 10, 15 years or something, and they're close, but no cigars still yet. It's a pretty, and even if they will be able to do that, it might not be the tool that your team is most familiar with. So the main difference, to summarize, I think, between when you're talking about frameworks and engines, is when you're talking about frameworks, mostly oriented towards programmer and the development team, and the programming team, sorry. See what I did there? Whereas when you have an engine, it's really for your whole you're trying to basically have something that, yes, your programmer are going to be able to use, but you want something that's bringing a certain ease of use for the rest of your team as well. And that's really, really key when choosing technology, whether you're actually aiming for web or you're aiming for just native platforms. Now, web development, actually, like when ActionScript fell out of favor, we actually lost a lot of things that we could do at the time that the web, for good reasons, for security reasons mostly, and well, on one hand, and on the other hand, just because like with sandboxing, but like there are certain things you could do in ActionScript that you couldn't do in JavaScript. The level at which you could do certain things in networking, for instance, is quite different. But WebAssembly is really going to change a lot of things. We've already seen really cool demos with Asm.js. WebAssembly, is going to bring a lot of speed. A lot of speed. There's certain there's a lot of articles you see online that are going to boast 10x performance boost on simple algorithm. But it's not really the only thing. I would argue it's not necessarily the most important thing when you're making a web game, depending on what you're actually trying to do, of course. But the size of the build is also going to be significantly lower. And that's something that has to be emphasized when you're talking about a game engine and you're talking about a game, because you're going to have a lot of code, right? Even if you're using an editor and you feel like, I'm not using any code, yay. That thing's going to generate a lot of code. And you want your build size to be extremely small. You want your asset to be like incredibly optimized, right? Whatever you can compress and whatever hack you can do to basically boil down your assets to something as simple as possible, you're gonna have to do. And that's where I actually, want to connect with the point that Cain made earlier, is that this is where learning your history of gaming helps a lot. Have you ever noticed that in Super Mario Brother, the clouds are the same shape as the bushes, and it's just a color change? What has been seen cannot be unseen. So, but basically, there's a lot of things that you can learn in optimization from the early age of game development that you can actually bring back to the web because of the fact that not because the size limits you necessarily, but because more and more there's people playing on mobile, and even with bandwidth increasing and the network performance getting better, you still want to get that snappy experience, right? That experience that feels fast when you're doing a view app. It's going to be the same thing in game. You don't want to be stuck in front of loading screen for 30 seconds, or even 10 seconds, or even 5 seconds whenever you start your game, right? No matter if it's just a simple tower defense game that's in 2D or a twin stick shooter in 3D, right? And the big thing also that I think personally, some people might actually find this debatable. The thing that is going to make a difference is threads and thread capability. JavaScript is single-threaded by nature, right? And yes, you can do worker, but if you look at any worker-based system, you always have the inter-process communication cost that basically comes in, and so you're kind of at a loss a little bit where, well, you'd like to actually offload stuff on a separate core, but might actually not be worth it. And of course, if you have the ability to go like kind of one level deeper and do a little bit more parallel programming, that kind of helps when you're making a game. But that's not going to be coming from JavaScript. It's going to be coming from stuff like Go, which already supports building to WASM. Somebody told me that like the logo suddenly became so much better recently. I don't know. That's actually the first one I found when I was looking for Go WASM. It's very simple. If you've ever developed in Go, you already know that basically doing cross-compiling is extremely easy. So it's really not much of a difference when you're actually saying you want to build some libraries in Go that's going to be targeting the web. And the same thing with Rust, where basically it's also been, I think it's still experimental. You have to add your targets as usual, but basically, you just build it like this when you're using cargo. And if you're using Rust C to compile, it's pretty much the same thing. But this is all still very recent in terms of stack, right? So if you are subscribing to, for instance, This Week in Rust, you're going to see there's like one library or one game framework a week that comes up. And that's really cool, but there's nothing that has become like a React or Vue or Angular of web development for WASM yet. And so a lot of stuff is kind of coming soon here. But do keep an eye on it. It will change. If you're not going to end up using any of those technology, understanding what WebAssembly can bring to doing, especially like high-performance game programming, it's really going to be a game changer here. So great. Now we have a way, to make a game run fast, to use as much resources as possible. We've looked at trying to basically make things small so that when we reload, because things aren't in cache anymore, that it's not going to take 20 seconds. To tell you a story, there's a game that we're going to be releasing, I think, in September, which is essentially all of this that we're talking about here. This 3D, it's a 3D multiplayer twin stick shooter. So all of these things would be relevant. If we could actually do it in WebAssembly, and we've already looked at it intensively, we would. But there is one problem that I think is where, coming from the web, I see a lot more people struggling, and it's networking. If you've ever researched, if you've ever punched in like game networking in Google, you get this Bible. Okay, Gaffer on games. Dan Fiddler is basically a guy who's been working and doing game networking for, I think, 25 years. He's seen it all. And his writing is over a span of multiple years, so you can see the generation of protocols evolving, the advent of WebSocket and how it can be used, what kind of challenges it brings in comparison to using stuff like UDP and building a custom protocol. This is where, of course, if you go into basically gameplay programming, for instance, you're going to have to learn some algorithmics if you do physics, some algorithmics. But here, you're really dealing kind of with systems, and you're dealing with things that sometimes get, it's like, spooky effect at distance, like quantum physics kind of thing. And it's very strange. And this, and Glenn Fiddler has a great series on networking. It will walk you through why you don't want normally to do TCP and why you have to do UDP. Problem is, we're on the web, so we don't have UDP. We have to do basically WebSocket, or we have to do request reply basically, so HTTP request. It may change in the future. There's basically HTTP 2 backed with Quick. There's possibilities there, sure. There's also possibilities using WebRTC, for instance, right? Of course. But the problem is that on one hand, what you could do with UDP isn't still available through any sort of API. So for server, for client server. And on the client, it's a little bit tricky because it will often depend on the type of game you want to make. If you're trying to do any sort of like, not massively multiplayer, but like 8 to 16 player FPS. There's I couldn't find it for the purpose of this talk, but John Carmack basically had a pretty good kind of like tweet series where he explained how the industry from the 2000 onward basically went back and forth from star topology with server in the middle to star topology with one player that basically is the authority, and then like the kind of protocols that you have to develop, the handshake protocols you'd have to develop to figure out which player has the best bandwidth, because that's kind of important. And then when that player goes off, what happens to your game? If you think distributed systems are hard, that's a whole can of worms that you're opening here. But long story short, most of the industry has reverted from in his opinion, and from what I've seen so far, it's reverted to basically server-centric infrastructure. And so, you could, now you might be thinking like, oh, I'm a clever hacker, maybe I'm gonna go and make WebRTC on the server. It's possible, but esoterical at best, for having tried it myself. And if you do actually figure out a good, simple, and straightforward architecture that's not going to, leave brain splatter behind the wall after seeing it, I would love to see it, because that might actually be an interesting way to go around some problems. But even if you don't care about, even if you put those limitations aside, what's interesting, and that's where, like, you know, making games a game within a game, you can do a lot more with even just TCP to get exactly what you want in very, very clever and often unintuitive way. So a few months ago, I think, I was in a conference call with a developer at one of Europe's major like kind of back-end as a service company for games. And I think the engineer I was talking to was coming, actually, he worked for a long time in Korea. And he was mostly coming from the streaming services. So basically video streaming and so on and so forth. And I was talking about to him some of the the articles I've read about doing experimental networking over essentially, instead of having a single WebSocket connection, you would have a number of WebSocket connections dependent on the frame rate, and you would either double or triple send messages. And the reason for that is so that if you end up with certain types of problems, which we're going to be talking about in a moment, you can kind of get around it and get that low latency that is so important. And interestingly enough, he says, we actually did that for video streaming. We would double stream every packet, and it would perform far better for anything that actually is remotely real time. So, like I mentioned a moment ago, latency is often seen as kind of like the big bad wolf. And when I started, when I started at Wizcorp, I actually didn't know anything about game network. But you'd have a lot of people that basically would have like the base, like, oh, you should use UDP, it's faster, or you should use UDP, it's lower latency. Those two things are actually not really true overall under normal condition. The kind of problem you're going to really run into is basically head-of-line blocking. So when you're sending game data, you often want to go and say, well, there's going to be a synchronous state that's going to be shared every once in a while, so that like everyone's kind of has all the same information. But then you're going to have stuff like events and positional data that you're going to have to stream, and just like a live video stream, you don't want to, well, actually in video stream you might, but like, in a game, you just want to say, well, I received this thing and it's really old. Well, we're just going to discard it. And if stuff gets lost, and you might actually end up being better with having like, some jitter in the game than, basically kind of freezing and then playing everything back for that's buffered for like 30 seconds at, a fraction of the speed. So head-of-line blocking is generally the reason why people say you don't use TCP for anything that's real time. You probably want to use something that's unreliable and build your own reliability protocol on top of that. You also have connectivity. Again, that has been consistently getting better, but you're going to have connection drops. You're going to have to deal with reconnects. You're going to have to deal with a lot of stuff that's going to boil up all the way into your game design. When you lose connectivity for a certain period of time, say 2 seconds, should you lose? Should you have a the custom behavior that is more fitting to your game design? Should you just be frozen in time and everyone, if it's a shooter, can shoot you? Well, there's no one real answer, but it is something that you have to deal with. And finally, there's fragmentation. And I couldn't really find anything good for fragmentation, so apologies for the violent imagery. But fragmentation is basically thinking about the size of the data that you're sending. And that's where you kind of have to brush up on your fundamentals in networking. Like, you're going to have to figure out, like, what's the header size for a TCP packet? What is the MTU and what does it mean? If you go over the MTU for a packet, what will happen? These are all questions that you have to be pretty clear on. if you want to make sure that you're not going to run into very, very spooky issues in your game development. And the cool thing, there's a lot more problems that we can get into. If you want to hear me geek out on game networking, I can do this after the talk. But the cool thing is that Unity has their network stack, I believe, mostly open source. And I invite you to basically have a look at it, to just understand how it works. And if you are looking for something that's truly fully open source and where there's an open source engine to it, there's one that's very interesting, which is the Cube 2 engine. It has been the engine that's been used. So this whole thing is a very interesting endeavor, especially for people that have an interest in web development. I think, although the game is actually a native one. So ENET is actually a protocol that was developed for a game that's called Sourdough. That has been for like the last 10 to 15 years, I think one of the most successful open source FPS. Not that there's a lot of them, but still. And there's a trove of technology that can be found in there, a trove of code that can be studied from ENET, from the Cube 2 engine as well. That is quite interesting, just to understand how you can do these things. And because it's open source, a lot of the stuff, if you wanted to just steal it and run with it, you could do it. It's just really great, I think. That capacity to collaborate is really cool. Fun fact, has anyone ever heard of flat buffer? Flat buffers? So flat buffers is basically like, there was this whole series where people were doing protocol buffer, then you had like Facebook did his own thing, there's the guy that, some guy that decided to go and do Captain Proto, sorry. And flat buffer is basically a serialization, deserialization stack that is cross-platform, like the other technologies I just mentioned. And the fun fact is that this guy has done that at Google, is I think still working in Google, and he was one of the principal developer for Sourdough and for that engine. So there's a lot of really cool people from industries that are generally related to the web that have been participating in that project or its related toolkit. So in summary, we've talked about where you can start from. We've talked about the differences between, how you generally treat frameworks versus how you're going to have to treat your engines and what should guide your selection. We've talked about WebAssembly and how it will have a huge impact in the future, and how you should really take an interest if you are expecting to do, or if you have the desire to do web games, really. And yeah, networking is hard. But the good news is that if you actually understand it for the web, you're going to understand it very well for other platforms. And therefore, if you actually end up going into the game industry, you could very well start and make your portfolio in using web technologies. You could do a lot of really cool experimental stuff if you're geeking out more into technology. You could do a lot of really pretty, beautiful, gorgeous stuff. And that's your thing. But the really cool thing is that you still get, in either case, the advantages of the web, which is snappy distribution. Obviously, you need to make it small size, but you can basically get it into the hands of anyone, anywhere, and pretty much anytime. And as a final conclusion to both talk, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No,
You good? I'm good? We're good. All right. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning when we started, Wizcorp is not a company that started in the game industry, and I certainly didn't start in the game industry. I had an interest in it. I ended up in a company that was doing web, ended up doing games. And like Cain mentioned, you're just kind of every day overwhelmed, literally overwhelmed with like, what the hell am I going to do with this? It doesn't, like, I don't even know where to start, right? And I work with a lot of programmers that are facing this problem on a regular basis. And I always tell them the old joke: how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You're not going to basically change the world on your own. And when you're making a demo, you're not going to make it amazing, mostly on your own, at least in a short period of time. But there's someone that's going to be starting with us shortly. When he showed us his demos, it was literally done in crayon style, right? It was, you know, a certain visual style, let's call it. But when we asked him about his game, he knew everything about it. He knew all the influences, and the game was fun, right? That's what you actually want to become if you want to not only find a job that's going to be what you want in the game industry, but one that you will find pleasant, and one where people will notice you, and where you're basically going to flourish. Any questions? Yep.
This is about the earlier part about frameworks for the web.
Yep.
So I'm making a 3D game in HTML, and I find that paradoxically, it often feels like the 3D is the easiest part, because you can just throw meshes of that on JS and it renders and fine. But then when you try to make like a game UI in Angular or Vue, and you're trying to draw like inventory, and it has to be drag and drop, and you want to maybe add visual effects to it, it's really, really, really painful.
I didn't necessarily mean that UI programming is easier than 3D or 2D.
Yeah, no,
right?
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how to make that less painful.
I'm sorry?
If you have any thoughts about what makes that kind of thing less painful, or how you can live your life in it?
Let me try to approach this in the context of game. But like, when you're making your app tree, right? You're saying like these are the screens you're going to go to, and then you're going to get into the game, right? There's a lot of stuff that can actually go wrong. It's like basically making that in Angular, and like you say, basically you could just like, we had an issue actually earlier today. Which app was that? Oh yeah, it was actually in Google Slides, where we found a bug where when you would right-click, go on a select something that has secondary menu, and just drag it on the line, and because the secondary menu actually is a little bit an overlay, it would actually just flicker every second, right? Yeah. There's like these insane kind of bugs that are going to happen, and yeah, that's definitely not making your job any easier. But on the other hand, if you're doing a 3D game, you can end up with stuff like suddenly speed is crazy, or physics works in spooky ways, and then you end up scratching your head in similar ways, I think. I think overall, really what it depends on is scale and exposure. So if you're making a large product, obviously quality is harder to maintain. It takes a lot more effort to keep everything cohesion. And if you build a product that is going to go into 1 million hands or 10 million hands versus something that's going to be in 10,000 hands, you're not going to be having the same kind of bug reports at all. That bug we stumbled upon, I am sure there's only a very, very infinitesimal fraction of people that ever even ran into it, right? But we did, and they're still like in volume. If you count the number of people, there's probably a lot of people that run into it anyway. But that's because it's Google, it's a Google product. There's literally billions of people that are using it, right? So I think it's a little bit more of that. It's like if you make a game, depending on, I don't know what product you're currently working on. But if you're working on a game, if you're working on a game that has the kind of like 10, 100 million user, you're going to run, I think, in the same kind of, not the same kind, but like the same complexity of bug. As a matter of fact, there was somebody that we interviewed recently that's been working, how many players was it? Like 200 million players? 300 million player a game. And like he was talking about, those bugs he was getting. It was just like, yeah, okay. Guess we're going to take 2 months to debug that. But again, from more functional scale. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a programming style problem. So today, maybe most of the game are using object-oriented programming style, right? So
right.
I read John Carmack's article. He said he trying to use Haskell to programming the Wolfenstein 3D. He said he can use less code and then much more efficient. So do you have any experience about this?
So using Haskell?
Yeah,
Haskell. Using functional?
Use functional programming. Maybe this is the next trend, or maybe something, because today
I don't. Are you asking my opinion?
Do you have any experience? Maybe
Experience?
Yeah.
Right. Experience? No. Not personally.
Compare, yeah.
I mean, I've done functional programming. I know Elixir is one of my pet language right now. I fell in love with the whole Erlang Elixir stack, a few years ago. But no, I don't necessarily have any relevant experience. If you ask me my opinion as to whether that's going to become a trend, well, I'm not sure. Because if you look at what happened in the web industry, what happened is the web industry reached a ludicrous scale. At which point, like, people started to look at the people that had been looking at doing distributed system, e.g. the Erlang guys, and basically stole all of their ideas. Basically that's it. And of course I'm saying the Erlang people, but there's the Haskell crowd, there's a lot of different functional languages you can make your pick. But I tend to go back to Erlang because Erlang is the one that basically has built-in distribution really at its core. The thing is that when you're doing programming for games, you don't necessarily need that. Now, again, if you're doing server-side programming, you might. If you're doing EVE Online, it's been developed, EVE Online was in stackless Python, right? Maybe you could do it with Elixir and Erlang. Would it be better? I don't know. That hasn't been done. And that kind of comes with the territory, right? If you're excited more about the technology, there's nothing that stops you in saying, like, you know what? I'm going to build this thing using functional style programming, just for the heck of it, right? And we'll see where it goes, right? I had a programmer once come to me, and he said, so I wrote this whole program without any conditionals. And I was like, what? And he's like, no, but look at it. I was like, huh. And would I code like that? No. But actually, I kind of do with Elixir, because Elixir is all about encryption, and you don't really use a conditional in the end. But yeah, is it going to make its way in the game industry? I don't think game industry really has to deal with that kind of scales. It might in the servers, the clients. One thing that I'm more interested into, if you want to go hardcore into distributed programming and what's the future and what they do in university, look up mobile ambience. You're not going to find a library that deals with that, but you're going to find an academic paper that basically talk about it. And that's very interesting. It's basically the concept of how will your code follow you across multiple devices, some that may be in IoT and some that may be in your life.
Well, just to work off of that, I don't know if there are any functional programming languages that are moving faster than C or C++. And so I feel like outside of indie games, it might be tough to find something that will scale to much larger.
You do find
But I don't know, this is my specialty.
Yeah, you do find some on the server side. Like I can never remember the name of the company, but there's one company in particular that wrote the matchmaking systems for Halo, and eventually that went on to become, I think it was Microsoft's matchmaking system, and that was written in Erlang.
Yeah, actually, there's that. There's Undead Lab,
And they, ironically, they switched from C++ to Erlang because the concurrency issues that they were facing over C++. So C++ is obviously going to be a fast language and probably better for highly processor-intensive kind of mathematical situations. But we're doing things like matchmaking, which is becoming more and more a thing in online games. So yeah, I don't think you necessarily see it on the front end. You won't see it in where the action takes place. You certainly see it on the server.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So last time, like, the WebAssembly space has been really hard to keep track of because it's literally like keeping track of multiple languages and the progress of those. So are there any projects in particular that you're keeping an eye on that look really promising?
Not yet. I just look at everything right now. And it's more a function of my work methodology than I would recommend working like that. But I just tend to read a lot, and I read about everything, and I know that somehow I'm going to remember something about it. And whenever I get an actual use case, it's going to, oh yeah, I kind of read about that thing, and then I'm going to read my mail archive. It's going to take me half a day to find the article I was looking for, and then I'm just going to start from there, basically. It works for me. Would it work for everyone? I don't know. Overall, I think if you wanted to narrow it down a bit, Rust is kind of where I would put my money. One, because basically a Muslim-backed project. 2, because a lot of the people that are in that ecosystem actually have, either whether because they were involved with Mozilla or just because of their interest in career, they have been involved in the web industry. 3, because talking about functional, it's actually kind of a language that it's not functional, but it actually brings the elements of functional programming that are kind of good. But at the same time, you get all the performance language tooling that you would expect from C++. So it's kind of a really interesting language for that. And I suspect that's the one reason why you see so many people. What is the game company that switched to Rust entirely recently?
Radiant Dawn? Radiant Dawn.
Radiant Dawn, right? So there's already companies that are switching to it to make their game fine. And if you're doing web, if you're talking about server, for instance, one really cool thing that we're playing with right now is to say, well, okay, we might want to write our server in, I don't know, Rust or C++ or whatever, and we might want to write our client for the web because we're doing a lot of web games. Well, if you have Rust, you can basically create shared libraries for either. And it's not necessarily going to work exactly out of the box, but there is a way to architecture your way through that. And so, yeah, Go is also interesting. I really love the simplicity of Go. But it's hard. It really feels kind of like architecturally speaking, and like in the ecosystem, it feels a little bit hard to compete with Rust right now. Yep.
What's the state of Unity and Unreal when it comes to WebAssembly?
You want to go?
Well, I don't know about Unreal, but I know that Unity released something just recently. I haven't even read the article because it's that new. But they have a build target for Quasar. So it looks like they're really pushing for that. Probably because C#, Microsoft announced something a couple of months back that they're officially targeting Quasar. And so I guess that just played through. But I've seen a few demos, actually working demos from Unity in WebAssembly, and they're really good. So side-by-side comparison between the usual WebGL export and the WASM build, it's just night and day.
So they actually have now an engine. I don't know, what is it, Turbo something?
The best compiler, you mean?
Yeah, like their compiling stack got a lot more elegant, a lot less crappier. If you've ever worked with Webpack and thought that was bad and slow, don't get involved with Unity's build tool stack because it's basically like long story short, I ended up on the mailing list and they basically saying like, why are you building everything on single core monothread when you have I have an 8-core machine? It's like, all right. But for Unreal, actually, we have a team doing a game jam right now. They are doing web exports, and right now they've done it in Asm.js. It worked pretty well, although it was a little bit slow, which was kind of what you expect. I would expect, but apparently you also have already the option of targeting WASM, so WebAssembly. So is it good? We're probably gonna figure out. I think we're gonna do more and more on Unreal because just people find it cool. So great, let's do that. But it does seem like it's gonna, that and other various reasons makes it so that Unreal might be very interesting in the future. Yep.
Yeah, I'm getting a subtle sense of deja vu though, because you're saying these web games are coming back with the WebM and stuff, and I feel like we had that when Flash existed. There was a whole ecosystem of ad matchmaking people, and you could monetize it and it would be distributed, and then that died because reasons, and there's now it's all been mobile, and now we're back to web. Why are we going in this circle? I guess is my question. Do we stop?
Because people are willing to pay for it.
But do we stop going in the circle? Will it still be web in a few years?
So just to specify, I mean, we happen to do web, we also do Unity. I just figured out that it'd be interesting to start from a web context, given the audience. Now, to address that kind of circle, it's a little bit more like, at least in Japan, it's a little bit more like a wave. So right now we're kind of riding we're on. It's a little tricky to say because it's right now it's a little bit weird. But last year you had like kind of, I think it was the third wave, and we kind of felt, oh, it went to a peak and things didn't go super well, so it kind of went down a little bit. There's a few players, like them tried some stuff, Yahoo tried some stuff, didn't really work. It started to go down, but then basically you have Line and Quick games that started to release on your phone. You can already play games through Line now that are actually web games. And so, that plus Facebook Instant Games and so on and so forth might actually kind of, instead of just doing the normal curveball that you'd end up with and then it's quiet for a while, you might actually give it a second swing. But I think it's just basically, the long story short, the reason why you see those waves is essentially just because of business environment. When we started to do web games, it was people trying to escape the app stores. Now we're trying to do web, and then there was a phase where we're doing web games because people, the organizations were trying to burn virtual currency such as point cards. So instead of basically saying you're going to redeem your points by getting some giggles when buying mail, whatnot, now you're going to use those points and you're going to use them. You're going to consume them in the game. And if you basically end up burning enough virtual currency like that, and in comparison to the cost of the game, basically it's it's more, then you basically end up making a profit, so to speak, right? So there's just like kind of different business reasons where I think the industry can end up coming back to the web. If you ask me my opinion as to why there should be web games, again, I think the closest we've had so far to getting it right is stuff like Facebook Instant Games. I'm not sure if the ecosystem that they're setting up is going to be entirely working out. I hope so. But I think it's the kind of the thing where the industry has got it the most right as to why would it be relevant to have web games. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. Okay. We can talk about it later if you want. Any other questions? Insults? Nintendo tricks? All right. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you guys so much for coming. So we do these events for free. We don't charge anything. So we ask if you liked it, please give us a star on Facebook or Meetup or whatever. If you didn't like it, don't do anything. Come to me. And we'll make sure that you like the next one. Also, one thing, before you guys leave, I hope all of you make a friend here. I really dislike going to meetups in Japan where people just show up, listen to someone talk, and then they leave as fast as they can. Please hang around, please mingle, please meet with each other, please talk to these awesome guys. And another round of applause to Wizcorp.